Good evening, afternoon, and morning to all of you who have joined us from different parts of the world for this month's JFK Peace Speech webinar. My name is Martin Schatz, and I'm a coordinator for the committee. And we have the pleasure of having Professor Peter Kuznick with us tonight to speak on how the most visionary 20th century presidential address almost changed the world. As is our custom, we'll watch the speech first, and then we'll have Professor Kuznick's remarks. And following that, we'll have a question and answer. So without further delay, let's watch President Kennedy's speech.
President Anderson, members of the faculty, Board of Trustees, distinguished guests, my old colleague, Senator Bob Byrd, who has earned his degree through many years of attending Knight Law School, while I am earning mine in the next 30 minutes, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pride that I participate in this ceremony of the American University, sponsored by the Methodist Church, founded by Bishop John Fletcher Hurst, and first opened by President Woodrow Wilson in 1914. This is a young and growing university, but it has already fulfilled Bishop Hurst's enlightened hope for the study of history and public affairs in a city devoted to the making of history and to the conduct of the public's business. By sponsoring this institution of higher learning for all who wish to learn, whatever their color or their creed, the Methodists of this area and the nation deserve the nation's thanks. And I commend all those who are today graduating. Professor Woodrow Wilson once said that every man sent out from a university should be a man of his nation, as well as a man of his time. And I'm confident that the men and women who carry the honor of graduating from this institution will continue to give from their lives, from their talents, a high measure of public service and public support. There are few earthly things more beautiful than a university, wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He did not refer to towers or to campuses. He admired the splendid beauty of a university because it was, he said, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived. And that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counterweapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interests to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication. One step in this direction is the proposed arrangement for a direct line between Moscow and Washington to avoid on each side the dangerous delays, misunderstandings, and misreadings of others' actions which might occur at a time of crisis. We have also been talking in Geneva about our first step measures of arms controls, designed to limit the intensity of the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace, which would take the place of arms. The pursuit of disarmament has been an effort of this government since the 1920s. It has been urgently sought by the past three administrations. And however dim the prospects are today, we intend to continue this effort, to continue it in order that all countries, including our own, can better grasp what the problems and the possibilities of disarmament are. The only major area of these negotiations where the end is in sight, yet where a fresh start is badly needed, is in a treaty to outlaw nuclear tests. The conclusion of such a treaty, so near and yet so far, would check the spiraling arms race in one of its most dangerous areas. It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. It would increase our security. It would decrease the prospects of war. Surely this goal is sufficiently important to require our steady pursuit, yielding neither to the temptation to give up the whole effort, nor the temptation to give up our insistence on vital and responsible safeguards. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce two important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. Second, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad. We must show it in the dedication of our own lives. As many of you who are graduating today will have an opportunity to do by serving without pay in the Peace Corps abroad or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. But wherever we are, we must all, in our daily lives, live up to the age-old faith that peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities today, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. It is the responsibility of the executive branch at all levels of government, local, state, and national, to provide and protect that freedom for all of our citizens by all means within our authority. It is the responsibility of the legislative branch at all levels, wherever the authority is not now adequate, to make it adequate. And it is the responsibility of all citizens in all sections of this country to respect the rights of others and respect the law of the land. All this is not unrelated to world peace. When a man's way please the Lord, the scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interests of both. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us. We want to now hear from Professor Peter Kuznick. I just want to say a few words about him. He's professor and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's a well-known peace activist, educator, and organizer, and the author of a number of books, including Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists and Political Activists in 1930s America. With Akira Kimura, he authored Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives. And he co-authored with Oliver Stone The Untold History of the United States, which has appeared in numerous editions, is a bestseller on 3 continents, has been translated into 20 languages, and was the basis for a 12-part Showtime documentary film. Peter is a native of New York and received his PhD from Rutgers University. Given the fact that he has more than 300 TV, documentary, and print interviews a year, we're extremely fortunate to have him with us today. So welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us. You have to unmute, Peter. Unmute yourself.
Should be able to.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, very good.
Great. Thanks, Marty, for that introduction. And it's an honor to be part of this program. When I think of the people who have participated before, it's an incredible group of thinkers and activists and proponents of peace. But I think I'm the first in two ways. One, I think I'm the first actual historian. Glenn Deason is a political scientist by training. And second, I think I'm the first professor or person from American University to participate in this forum. So, but anyway, thank you again for inviting me. The latest developments in Doha and Poland and Utah make tonight's meeting even more timely and poignant than it was when I agreed to join this discussion, although we've been on an accelerating march to war for the last few years. It's sad to think that the current standard bearer for the Kennedy family is RFK Jr., who spends his days carrying water for Donald Trump, spreading nonsense about vaccines, and destroying the best aspects of America's medical research. But there are times when the Kennedy name represented something very different in American life. It represented something positive, something hopeful, something progressive. It represented a Democratic Party that harkened back to the days of FDR and Henry Wallace, and not those of Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, or Joe Biden. It's invigorating to listen again to Kennedy's words. On June 10th, 1963, Kennedy delivered that historic American University commencement address, which I consider the most visionary American presidential speech of the 20th century. It came just 8 months after the world had teetered on the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Getting from the missile crisis to the commencement address required a remarkable transformation on Kennedy's part. As this audience knows, Kennedy had been a staunch Cold Warrior. He supported Richard Nixon's red-baiting congressional campaign against progressive Democrat Helen Gahagan Douglas. The Kennedy family was not only friendly with Joseph McCarthy, Jack's younger brother Robert had been on McCarthy's staff. Illness enabled Kennedy to miss the December 1954 Senate vote to censor Joe McCarthy. When Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage, came out in 1956, Eleanor Roosevelt astutely commented that she wished Kennedy had, quote, a little less profile and a little more courage. Kennedy might have had good looks, charm, a sense of humor, and a beautiful wife, but the progressive Roosevelt-Stevenson wing of the Democratic Party didn't trust him at all. His opportunistic, though politically astute, choice of Lyndon Johnson as running mate confirmed the liberals' mistrust. More positively, he had also shown a healthy disdain for European colonialism, which would serve him well in avoiding war in Laos and planning to extricate the U.S. from Vietnam after his 1964 re-election. In August of 1957, the Soviet Union successfully tested the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. For the Soviets, ICBMs could potentially offset the enormous military advantage the U.S. derived from bombers housed at NATO bases in Europe. Less than 2 months later, on October 4th, 1957, while the school desegregation crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, dominated American news, and Leave It to Beaver made its television debut, a Soviet ICBM launched the first artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. Sputnik weighed 184 pounds and was 22.8 inches in diameter. It orbited the Earth once every 96 minutes and 17 seconds. Soviet officials crowed about the triumph of Soviet science and technology, which they claimed proved the overall superiority of the Soviet Union's new socialist society. The Soviets had indeed punctured the belief that U.S. technological sophistication and Soviet backwardness would guarantee U.S. victory in the Cold War. Some Americans panicked. speculating that the Soviets must now have ICBMs with nuclear warheads poised to attack U.S. targets. That fear was fueled by the Soviet announcement 3 days after Sputnik's launch that it successfully tested a new ballistic missile compatible thermonuclear warhead. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson warned that the Soviets would, quote, soon be dropping bombs on us from space like kids dropping rocks onto cars from freeway overpasses. One satirist cracked, quote, General LeMay is planning to send a fleet of bombers around the world to impress the Russians. I'm sure it will if they bother to look down. The fact that the Soviets had beaten the US into space tore deep cracks in the fragile facade of American confidence, a confidence that had already been shaken by the Korean War and domestic and foreign policy crises of the first 7 years of the decade. Critics decried the shallow materialism and purposelessness of American life and enumerated the shortcomings of the educational system. The administration deliberately downplayed the threat posed by the Soviet achievement in an effort to reassure the public. Quote, the satellite does not rouse my apprehensions, Eisenhower said, not one iota. I can see nothing that is significant. They've put one small ball into the air. To drive the point home, I played 5 rounds of golf that week. He could not disclose the reason for his lack of concern. Highly secret U-2 reconnaissance planes flying above 70,000 feet had been crossing Soviet airspace for more than a year, taking photos revealing that the Soviets lagged behind in the arms race. Alan Dulles later chortled, I was able to get a look at every blade of grass in the Soviet Union, but it would still be a few years before that was true. On November 3rd, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, a massive 6-ton satellite carrying a live dog named Laika. Now on the defensive, Eisenhower highlighted the U.S. vast military superiority and his intention to stay far ahead in the arms race. Quote, our nation has enough power in its strategic retaliatory forces to bring near annihilation to the war-making capabilities of any other country. Atomic submarines have been developed. In numbers, our stock of nuclear weapons is so large and so rapidly growing that we are well ahead of the Soviets, both in quantity and in quality. We intend to stay ahead. The United States even contemplated detonating a Hiroshima-sized atomic bomb on the moon to restore its prestige. It was Carl Sagan, among others, who dissuaded the U.S. from undertaking that bizarre initiative. Later in the decade, the Air Force devised even more grandiose schemes, including putting missile bases on the moon. And then if the Soviets put their missiles on the moon, we were going to put ours on other planets to be able to shoot down their missile bases on the moon. Propelled by the irrational fear of being overtaken by the Soviets, intelligence officials advanced preposterous estimates of Soviet military strength. In December 1957, a national intelligence estimate projected a potential Soviet arsenal of 100 operational ICBMs in the next 2 years, and projected a worst-case scenario of 500 Soviet ICBMs by 1960. Eisenhower commissioned a top-secret security review headed by H. Rowan Gaither of the Ford Foundation. The report predicted that by 1959, quote, the USSR may be able to launch an attack with ICBMs carrying megaton warheads against which the Strategic Air Command will be almost completely vulnerable under present programs. It recommended commencing a massive U.S. military buildup to counter the growing missile gap, increasing the number of ICBMs to be deployed in 1959 from 80 to 600, and increasing the number of intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe from 60 to 240. It also called for a $25 billion national fallout shelter program. When the report was leaked to the press, the Washington Post painted a dire picture. Quote, the still top secret Gaither report, the Post wrote, portrays the United States in the gravest danger in its history. It pictures the nation moving in frightening course to the status of a second-class power. It shows an America exposed to an almost immediate threat from the missile-bristling Soviet Union. It finds America's long-term prospect one of cataclysmic peril in the face of rocketing Soviet military might and of a powerful growing Soviet economy and technology. To prevent what otherwise appears to be an inevitable catastrophe, the Gaither report urgently calls for an enormous increase in military spending from now through 1970. Sputnik provided the Democrats a tremendous political opening. Among those who enthusiastically jumped on this missile gap bandwagon was the junior senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. By late 1957, Kennedy was warning that the U.S. might be several years behind the Soviets in intermediate and long-range ballistic missiles. Egged on by his friend, the columnist Joseph Alsop, Kennedy adopted an even more alarmist tone the following year. Alsop had accused the Eisenhower administration of gross untruth regarding U.S. national defense. He detailed the scope of this projected missile gap. In 1959, Alsop said, the U.S. would have 0 ICBMs, the Soviets 100. In succeeding years, the ratio would be 30 U.S. to 500 Soviet in 1960, 70 to 1,000 in 1961, 130 to 1,500 in 1962, and 130 again to 2,000 in 1963. Relying largely on Alsop's information, in quotes, Kennedy rose up in the Senate to decry the United States missile lag, which would soon produce, quote, a peril more deadly than any wartime danger we've ever known, unquote, increasing the possibility of a Soviet attack. Eisenhower, whose U-2 surveillance plans had failed to identify a single deployed ICBM, had little patience for Washington insiders who tried to exploit the missile gap to advance their own careers. He dismissed them as sanctimonious, hypocritical bastards. The United States' interests and prestige were dealt another devastating blow when revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara toppled Cuba's U.S.-friendly dictator, Fulgencio Batista, on New Year's Day 1959. American corporations had dominated the island since 1898. In 1959, they controlled more than 80% of Cuba's mines, cattle ranches, utilities, and oil refineries, 50% of Cuba's railroads, and 40% of her sugar industry. When the U.S. tried to strangle the new regime economically, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for aid. On March 17, 1970, Eisenhower instructed the CIA to organize a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. Kennedy barely defeated Nixon in 1960. He rode to office on the back of the non-existent missile gap and an anti-communism so fierce that he excoriated Richard Nixon for having been soft on the communists in the aftermath of Sputnik and the Cuban Revolution. That was a pretty outlandish accusation, but it worked, narrowly. Kennedy appointed Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense and set him about figuring out the truth of the missile gap. McNamara reported 3 weeks later that there was a missile gap, and but it was in the U.S. favor. In October of 1961, Kennedy decided to come clean on the striking disparity between U.S. and Soviet military strength. He authorized Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick to publicly flaunt the U.S. superiority. Gilpatrick's speech was carefully crafted by a young Rand consultant named Daniel Ellsberg. Gilpatrick announced that the United States, quote, has a nuclear retaliatory force of such lethal power that an enemy move that brought it into play would be an act of self-destruction. The total number of our nuclear delivery vehicles, tactical as well as strategic, is in the tens of thousands. McNamara publicly confirmed the fact that U.S. possessed nuclear powers several times that of the Soviet Union. Several times was an understatement. The U.S. had approximately 45 ICBMs. The Soviets had only 4, and those were very vulnerable to U.S. attack. The U.S. had more than 3,400 deliverable nuclear warheads on submarines and bombers. The U.S. had more than 1,500 heavy bombers to the Soviets' 192. The U.S. also had 120 intermediate-range ballistic missiles stationed in Turkey, Britain, and Italy, 1,000 tactical fighter bombers within range of the USSR, and nuclear missiles on Polaris subs. Overall, the U.S. had approximately 25,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets had 1/10 that number. Despite the fact that U.S. nuclear superiority was vast and growing, the Air Force wanted to increase the number of missiles to 3,000. The Strategic Air Command wanted 10,000. McNamara's studies showed that the U.S. did not need more than 400, but he settled on 1,000 as the lowest number he could get away with under the circumstances. The Soviets, knowing how far ahead the U.S. already was, concluded that the U.S. was preparing for a first strike to wipe the Soviet Union out. Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski interpreted Gilpatrick's October statement to mean that, quote, the imperialists are planning a surprise nuclear attack on the USSR and the socialist countries. War seemed terrifyingly close in the fall of 1961. Poet Robert Lowell wrote, quote, all autumn, the chafe and jar of nuclear war, we have talked our extinction to death. This was just months after the Bay of Pigs fiasco of April 1961, when 1,500 CIA-trained and equipped Cuban exiles invaded Cuba, hoping to spark an uprising among the Cuban people. It didn't happen. Shortly before midnight, Kennedy, Johnson, McNamara, and Rusk met with Joint Chiefs Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, Navy Chief Admiral Arleigh Burke, and CIA Chief of Clandestine Services Richard Bissell for 3 hours. Kennedy held firm and refused aid, as he warned beforehand he would. Lemnitzer charged that, quote, pulling out the rug was unbelievable, absolutely reprehensible, almost criminal. Kennedy said to a friend, quote, we're not going to plunge into an irresponsible action just because a fanatical fringe in this country puts so-called national pride above natural reason. 114 invaders were killed. 1,189 were captured. The Wall Street Journal declared that, quote, the United States finds itself in a sorry mess. This country is reviled around the world, but we suspect that the deeper feeling, especially in the capitals of international communism, is one of astonishment at U.S. weakness. The entire sordid affair had a profound effect on the inexperienced president. Kennedy developed a healthy skepticism toward military advisors and intelligence officials. He explained to Arthur Schlesinger, if someone comes to me and tells me this or that about the minimum wage bill, I have no hesitation in overruling them. But you always assume that the military and the intelligence people have some secret skill not available to ordinary mortals. Kennedy told journalist Ben Bradley, the first advice I'm going to give my successor is to watch the generals and avoid feeling that just because they're military men, their opinions on military matters are worth a damn. Kennedy's post-invasion remarks seemed to reveal the first flickering of understanding of Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. But Kennedy's learning curve would need to be a sharp one for him to escape the steel trap of Cold War thinking. Following the botched invasion, Kennedy decided to shake up the Joint Chiefs, sons of bitches, and those CIA bastards. He threatened to, quote, shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He replaced CIA Director Alan Dulles with conservative Republican businessman John McCone. He forced the resignation of Deputy Director Richard Bissell and Deputy Director General Charles Cabell. He placed all CIA agents and other overseas U.S. personnel under the local ambassador and took steps to cut the CIA budget, shooting for a 20% reduction by 1966. He named General Maxwell Taylor to replace Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs the following June, but hoping to placate hawkish critics, he chose Curtis LeMay as Air Force Chief of Staff, a decision he would come to regret. Still reeling from the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy has a disastrous Vienna summit meeting with Khrushchev in June, followed by the Berlin crisis in July. At a special meeting on July 20th, Lemnitzer and other military officials briefed Kennedy on plans for nuclear war. Lemnitzer reviewed a report detailing a surprise attack, which Kennedy disclaimed in his commencement address that we just heard, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union for late 1963. Kennedy asked how long, if war occurred, U.S. citizens would have to remain in fallout shelters. 2 weeks, he was told. He ordered that no one present ever disclose the subject of the meeting. Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick reported that Lemnitzer had given the briefing as though it were for a kindergarten class. Finally, Kennedy got up and walked right out in the middle of it, and that was the end of it. In his 1990 memoir, Dean Russ describes Kennedy's reaction. Quote, President Kennedy clearly understood what nuclear war meant and was appalled by it. In our many talks together, he never worried about the threat of assassination, but he occasionally brooded over whether it would be his fate to push the nuclear button. In September, Lemnitzer briefed Kennedy, McNamara, and Rusk on PSYOP 62, including the option for a full-scale preemptive attack against the Soviet Union. After, Kennedy disgustedly said to Rusk, and we call ourselves the human race. In January of 62, Robert Kennedy told CIA head John McCone that overthrowing Castro was the top priority of the United States government. The U.S. had just launched Operation Mongoose, a CIA terror campaign against Cuba. And in March of 62, the U.S. launched Operation Northwoods, a series of fabricated pretexts as an excuse for invading Cuba. The Soviets put missiles into Cuba to both counter presumed U.S. plans for a first strike against the Soviet Union and to block U.S. plans to invade Cuba. The U.S. actually had specific war plans for an invasion, including Operation Orsak, which was supposed to take place in October of 1962. Orsak, as you know, was Castro spelled backwards. Kennedy's contempt for the military and intelligence community was reinforced by their warmongering and unrelenting pressure on him during the 1966 Cuban Missile Crisis, pressure to bomb the missile sites in Cuba, invade the island, and topple the Castro government. Advice we now know would have triggered World War III. I could go on at length about the missile crisis, but given time constraints, I just want to mention a few crucial aspects that we need to keep in mind. Unlike the self-serving account by Robert Kennedy, in his posthumously published bestseller 13 Days, in which he portrays himself standing heroically, shoulder to shoulder with his brother, the president, it was more often that Robert Kennedy or that John Kennedy stood alone, or at times with Adlai Stevenson, who he and Robert unfairly disparaged, against the pressure from his military and civilian advisors to bomb the missile sites and invade. Too often, Robert Kennedy stood with the Hawks. When I emphasized that fact at a Vatican event on the 60th anniversary of the crisis, which I spoke along with Jeff Sachs and Kerry Kennedy, uh, Kerry got very angry with me. But as a historian, I couldn't support the apocryphal account in Robert's book or in the Hollywood movie 13 Days. During the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev had good reason to be terrified. They understood that despite their efforts to resolve the crisis without going to war, they had lost control of events. A series of incidents occurred, any one of which could have triggered the nuclear holocaust that they both desperately sought to avoid. A SAC test missile was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base toward the Marshall Islands. U.S. planes crossed the border of the Soviet Union, and U.S. officials mistakenly reported that Tampa and Minnesota were under Soviet attack. When Kennedy met with the Joint Chiefs on October 19th, 1962, the majority, led by LeMay, favored an airstrike to destroy the missiles. LeMay assured Kennedy that the Soviets would not respond to an attack on missiles in Cuba. Kennedy replied that they would have to respond, if not in Cuba, then in Berlin. LeMay welcomed that scenario, believing the time was ripe not only to overthrow Castro, but to wipe out the Soviet Union. Kennedy was shaken by LeMay's cavalier attitude toward the possibility of nuclear war. After a meeting, he remarked to his aide, Kenny O'Donnell, "Can you imagine LeMay saying a thing like that? These brass hats have one great advantage in their favor. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them they were wrong." Kennedy implicitly understood the fallacy of all deterrence theory. It works until it doesn't work, and then there'll be nobody left alive to tell its proponents that they were wrong. The majority wanted to follow up the strike with an invasion. Kennedy confided to his brother Robert that if he didn't take strong action, he would be impeached. But in the coming days, he rejected the advice of his military leaders, of the civilian hardliners, Atchison and Nitze, and of former President Eisenhower, and he opted for the blockade, which he referred to as a quarantine, to downplay the fact that this too was an act of war. LeMay was furious. Quote, "This is almost as bad as the impeachment in Munich," he charged at the October 19th meeting. Tensions continued to ratchet up, and on October 22nd, SAC went to DEFCON 3. At 10:30 a.m. on October 24th, for the first time in history, SAC was placed on DEFCON 2 and prepared to strike targets in the Soviet Union. Thereafter, the SAC fleet remained airborne, refueled by aerial tankers, getting ready to attack with close to 3,000 nuclear weapons, expected to kill hundreds of millions of people, with bombers on Okinawa not targeting the Soviet Union, but targeting China. On October 27th, an incident occurred that Schlesinger accurately described as, quote, "not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history." A Navy group led by the carrier USS Randolph began dropping depth charges near a Soviet B-59 submarine sent to protect the Soviet subs approaching Cuba. Those inside the U.S. destroyers were unaware that the Soviet sub was carrying nuclear weapons. Soviet signals officer Vadim Orlov described the scene. Quote, "The depth charges exploded right next to the hull. It felt like you were sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer. The situation was quite unusual, if not to say shocking, for the crew. The temperature rose sharply, especially inside the submarine's engine room. The ship went dark, with only emergency lights continuing to function. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air reached near lethal levels. People could hardly breathe. One of the duty officers fainted and fell down. Then another followed. Then the third one. They were falling like dominoes, but we were still holding on, trying to escape. We were suffering like this for about 4 hours. Then the Americans hit us with something stronger. We thought, that's it, the end. Panic ensued. Commander Valentin Savitsky tried unsuccessfully to reach the general staff. He then ordered the officer in charge of the nuclear torpedo to prepare it for battle, and he shouted, "The war's already started up there while we're down here doing somersaults. We're going to blast them now. We'll die, but we'll sink them all. We'll not disgrace our Navy." Savitsky turned to the two other officers aboard for their approval. One agreed, but political officer Vasily Arkhipov refused to launch, single-handedly preventing nuclear war. In the midst of this harrowing confrontation, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council received word that a U-2 plane had been shot down over Cuba. The Joint Chiefs, believing the Soviets were trying to blind the U.S., demanded that Kennedy immediately authorize an airstrike and invasion. With reconnaissance missions also drawing fire, reports came in that Soviet missiles were being placed on launchers. Kennedy acknowledged that, quote, time was running out. The United States completed its preparations. 250,000 troops were mobilized and ready to invade. Plans were in place to install a new Cuban government. 2,000 bombing sorties were readied. The invasion seemed imminent. The next morning, following Robert Kennedy's desperate last-minute meeting with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, the Soviets announced that they would withdraw the missiles. In his 1970 memoir, Khrushchev claimed that Robert Kennedy's message was even more desperate. Quote, if the situation continues for much longer, the president is not sure that the military will not overthrow him and seize power. The American military could get out of control. The United States had come within a hair's breadth of invading Cuba. U.S. officials, it turned out, had little idea of what they were about to encounter had they done so. Reconnaissance flights had succeeded in photographing only 33 of the 42 SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles and had never found the nuclear warheads that were also present. SS-5 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which could travel 2,200 miles and hit most of the continental U.S., had also been shipped. The U.S. remained completely ignorant of the fact that Soviets had also placed approximately 100 battlefield nuclear weapons in Cuba to repel a U.S. invading force. Anticipating that the U.S. forces would confront 10,000 Soviet military personnel and 100,000 armed Cubans, the U.S. expected to suffer 18,000 total casualties and 4,500 dead in an invasion. When McNamara later learned that there were actually more than 42,000 Soviet military personnel, not 10,000, and 270,000 armed Cubans, not 100,000, he raised the estimate of U.S. deaths to 25,000. 30 years after the crisis in 1992, McNamara discovered at a conference in Havana that battlefield nuclear weapons would likely have been used against U.S. invaders. He turned white and responded that in that case, 100,000 Americans would have died, and the U.S. would have responded by wiping out the Soviet Union. Definitely wiping out Cuba and almost certainly wiping out the Soviet Union. All-out nuclear war would have ensued. Hundreds of millions of people would have perished, possibly all mankind. Realizing, as did Kennedy, that they had averted war as much by luck as by statesmanship during the crisis, Nikita Khrushchev reached out to Kennedy with an appeal to halt the madness. He wrote on October 30th, evil has brought some good. The good is that now people have felt more tangibly the burning flames of thermonuclear war and have a more clear realization of the threat looming over them if the arms race is not stopped. He daringly proposed eliminating, quote, everything in our relations capable of generating a new crisis. He offered a non-aggression treaty between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. But even better, he said, why not disband all military blocs? He called for an end to all nuclear tests, not just in the atmosphere, as a step toward complete disarmament, and encouraged resolution of both the German question and the imbroglio over the seating of China at the United Nations. He urged Kennedy to offer his own counter proposals, but Kennedy's lukewarm response dashed Khrushchev's hopes for real progress. It took a visit to Moscow in early December by Saturday Review editor and anti-nuclear activist Norman Cousins to break the impasse. Cousins had been one of the leading critics of the madness of the earlier nuclear age, with his powerful condemnation of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in editorials such as Modern Man is Obsolete, which described the primitive fear gripping the nation in the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombings. Before Cousins departed for Moscow, in what would prove one of the most successful instances of citizen diplomacy during the Cold War, Kennedy asked him to help convince Khrushchev that Kennedy too wanted to improve relations and to negotiate an arms control treaty. Cousins and Khrushchev met for over 3 hours, during which Khrushchev said something that remains haunting in its simplicity and incontrovertible truth. Quote, peace is the most important goal in the world. If we don't have peace and nuclear bombs start to fall, what difference will it make whether we are communists or Catholic or capitalists or Chinese or Russians or Americans? Who could tell us apart? Who will be left to tell us apart? Khrushchev was sincere in his abhorrence of nuclear war, having a decade earlier, after his initial briefing on the devastation that such a war would cause, having been unable to sleep for days. Khrushchev expressed confidence that they could agree on a test ban treaty inspection regime that would satisfy U.S. concerns about Soviet cheating and Soviet concerns about U.S. spying. Prospects looked good until Kennedy, under pressure from U.S. hawks, sharply increased the number of on-site inspections that the U.S. would demand. With prospects for a treaty faltering, Cousins returned to Moscow to speak with Khrushchev again in April of 1963, and on return explained to Kennedy the pressure the Soviet leader was under from his hawkish advisors. Kennedy observed, quote, one of the ironic things about this entire situation is that Mr. Khrushchev and I occupy approximately the same political positions inside our governments. He would like to prevent a nuclear war, but is under severe pressure from his hardline crowd, which interprets every move in that direction as appeasement. I've got similar problems. Kennedy sent Undersecretary of State and former U.S. Ambassador Averell Harriman to Moscow. Harriman cabled Kennedy that Khrushchev, quote, meant what he was saying about peaceful coexistence, unquote. The two had attended a U.S.-Soviet track meet at Lenin Stadium. The crowd went wild when the American and Soviet runners marched onto the field arm in arm. Harriman and Khrushchev rose to a huge ovation. Harriman said he saw tears in Khrushchev's eyes. Cousins revisited Moscow to speak with Khrushchev, and on return, it conveyed Khrushchev's frustration with Kennedy's thus far tepid response. Kennedy asked what he could do to reassure the Soviet leader of his sincerity. Cousins urged Kennedy to deliver a stirring speech calling for ending the Cold War and starting a new era of U.S.-Soviet friendship. He even submitted a draft, which Ted Sorensen and other close Kennedy advisors built upon without any input from the CIA, the State Department, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On June 10th, Kennedy proffered his vision for world peace to American university students, faculty, and guests. He said he had chosen this time and place to discuss the most important topic on earth, world peace. What kind of peace do we seek, he asked, as we just heard, not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, but the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. War, he insisted, makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all of the Allied air forces in the Second World War. When all we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. He then went even further. Quote, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Cold War, he said. As of speaking to American and Russian leaders 62 years into the future, he wisely advised, quote, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. Kennedy concluded with the upbeat words, we shall do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace. And embedded in the speech is one passage whose poignance has haunted listeners for generations. Much like Martin Luther King's prescient and unforgettable speech the night before his assassination. Kennedy said, quote, and if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. But it was the prospect of improving relations with the Soviet Union that excited him the most. It is sad, he admitted, to realize the extent of the gulf between us, but it is also a warning to the American people not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. Khrushchev called it, quote, the greatest speech by an American president since Roosevelt. Although Kennedy would barely survive another 4 months before being cut down in Dallas, and the old Cold War in him would occasionally again raise its head, it was clear that Kennedy was intent upon changing the course of history, as Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and others confirmed. He proudly achieved the first nuclear arms control agreement and intended to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam. He took steps to replace the space race with joint exploration, and even contemplated a much-needed course correction on Cuba. He told friends that he would conclude another arms control agreement and then become the first sitting president to ever visit the communist heartland, where he would receive a hero's welcome. That this never occurred was a tragedy of unspeakable proportions, one from which the world has still not recovered. As today's proxy war between Russia and NATO in Ukraine, the horrors in Gaza, the war planning in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea, the provocations in the Caribbean, the drones that overflew Poland make sadly and dangerously apparent today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We're going to have question and answers for a while, and I'm going to ask people to put their questions in the chat. Excuse me, we already have a couple questions there. But before we go on to that, I just want to mention to people that next month on October 10th, Norman Solomon, the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy and national director of rootsaction.org, will be with us, and people will be receiving an ad on that event in a follow-up for this meeting, which will include the recording of this meeting. So please put your questions in the chat, and let me just go and sort of pick up a question for you. Um, so Todd has asked, are you able to discuss the real fear that President Kennedy had of the military intel conservative movement leaders coup? As he said, my now deceased friend William Polk told me he feared, leading to the movie as a warning, 7 Days in May. Do you, in other words, I guess a coup, his fears about a coup. Do you,
He got an advance copy of the novel 7 Days in May, and he said to a friend, "So the 7 Days in May, for those who don't know, is about a liberal president wanting to end the Cold War and establish friendly relations with the Soviet Union, who gets overthrown in a military coup." And Kennedy said to a friend, "You know, it could happen." He said, "If there's a first Bay of Pigs, they will think the president is in way over his head. If there's a second Bay of Pigs, they'll start to consider doing something more dramatic." He said, "But if there's a third Bay of Pigs, they'll be ready to move and they could stage a coup and overthrow the president." Kennedy had 7 or 8 Bays of Pigs. Uh, we could enumerate some of them. He opted for a neutralist solution in Laos, which infuriated the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He called for and started moving toward friendly relations with Cuba, which they hated. He called for, in the speech and other times, an end to the Cold War. He made very clear that he had plans to withdraw from Vietnam. He opted for a peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That might have been the worst thing to them. General LeMay said Kennedy called the Joint Chiefs in for to thank them for their assistance, and LeMay said, "We lost. We should go in there now and bomb the Cubans." The Joint Chiefs was furious. Kennedy also wanted joint space exploration with the Soviets rather than a race into space, which was his signature achievement in many ways. I mean, if we go down the list of what everything Kennedy was doing in that last year of his life, it was flying in the face of very hawkish Joint Chiefs of Staff. So Kennedy knew he was vulnerable not only for overthrow, but for assassination. And then the other one, of course, was the partial arms control treaty, which Sorensen, Kennedy's friend and speechwriter, said gave him more pleasure than anything, any satisfaction than any other achievement in his presidency. And he overcame strong odds in order to win that. Unfortunately, it was a partial treaty, not the full one that he and Khrushchev wanted. But there were so many things that he did that outraged the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is why there are many people, when they look for who were the actual assassins, point either to a runaway clique or cabal in the CIA or in the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
okay, thank you. Another question was, how do you think JFK would respond to the shift in the global South to calls for a new security and a development order?
I think the Kennedy of 1963 would have welcomed it with open arms. What we've seen the last couple of weeks are some of the most exciting developments in years. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Tianjin, and the fact that Putin and Modi attended holding hands, that Modi went to Tianjin and met with Putin and Xi Jinping, that they express this that conciliatory attitude. I've been calling for collaboration for getting past the hostility between China and India for years now. This was a very exciting development. Then the meeting in Vladivostok, and you put those groups together, and the BRICS executive meeting that just took place. What we see is the center of world gravity shifting from the United States and Europe to the global south, and China and India in the potential forefront of that new alignment. I know India has been, in some ways, backsliding a little bit, but this is the direction the world is going. For example, at its height, uh, Europe represented about 35% of global GDP. Now Europe represents 15% of global GDP. By the end of the decade, it'll be down to 13%. The countries involved in the SCO represent about 45%. If we put that together with all the other alliances in the third world, including the African Union, they represent about 82% of global GDP. The question is, will the U.S. be part of that direction, or is the U.S. going to cling to unipolarity and to war making? I hope the U.S. joins and plays a positive role in global development. But the major force for global development is the Belt and Road Initiative on the part of the Chinese right now. The U.S. has been an obstructor, and we see what's going on during the Trump administration. So I think that the Kennedy of 1961 and 62 might have resisted it, but the Kennedy of 1963 would have welcomed this with open arms.
Right. One just comment I have is that there was a correspondence going on between Kennedy and Khrushchev, sort of a private correspondence in which they were sharing their concerns with each other. Do you think that was a significant process?
It was very significant, but on the same day that the French journalist went down there to Cuba with greetings from Kennedy, and Castro told him that Kennedy's got great promise, great potential, and that maybe we can establish friendship. But at the same time, the CIA was hiring another assassin to go down there to assassinate Castro. So, we can't say with absolute certainty, that Kennedy had changed 100%, but he clearly had changed more than 90%.
Excuse me, did I say Castro? Because I meant Khrushchev and Kennedy.
Oh, yeah.
The secret sort of a private correspondence that they were having sort of from fairly early on, I think, in the administration. Is that correct?
Yes. Much like the private correspondence between Reagan and Gorbachev, which was so much more friendly, conciliatory, and peaceful than a lot of the public rhetoric. And you see the same thing with Putin now. A close friend of mine very recently spent 40 minutes with Putin. And what Putin talked about, among other things, was the pressure he's under from the nationalists inside Russia, the hawks, the extremists who attack him for being too conciliatory and too moderate in his dealings with Ukraine. Kennedy and Khrushchev were both in the same position in 1962 and 1963, which greatly limited them, but they were moving very rapidly toward creating a different kind of world, which is what made that so exciting, and which we haven't had that potential. You could say that Jimmy Carter might have come to office with some positive vision, but that got beaten out of him in the last 2 years of his presidency. And that Gorbachev and Reagan, at when they met in October of 1986, they came within one word of eliminating nuclear weapons. Had Reagan agreed to limit Star Wars, SDI, to the laboratory for 10 years. And in fact, it hadn't barely entered the laboratory at that time in 1986. Then Gorbachev would have agreed to give up all offensive nuclear weapons. But Reagan refused to do it, and Gorbachev was devastated by it. So, we've had that potential. We need to increase that right now. And I hope that there are positive discussions going back and forth between Trump and Putin. But, Trump sounds like a peacemaker one day and then a warmonger the next day. So I don't know how anybody can really trust what he says enough to really take him at his word.
Um, well, there was a question about the topic that you chose as for your thing, and that was how the most visionary spirit almost changed the world. And I guess one of the things I would like to say is that one of the reasons we're holding these webinars every month is that Kennedy may have passed away, but the speech has not passed away. And the speech does have the potential to change the world if people can understand the principles that he's articulating, because they're extremely relevant in any situation we find ourselves in today. And
Yeah, no, that's so true. Can you imagine Donald Trump making a speech like this, or even understanding a speech like this, or sharing 1/100th of the sentiments behind the speech?
but what if a sufficient number of the American people understood this speech and were pressing their leaders to kind of follow the principles of speech, then we might be in a different situation.
And hopefully we will be. What Oliver and I said in Untold History, at least the documentary, is that Kennedy was struck down in 1963 by a lot of the same forces that had struck down Henry Wallace in 1944-45 when he tried to make a peaceful world. And that Khrushchev gets toppled the following year in 1964. And but that the vision that the two of them embraced uh, didn't die with them. That it will continue to germinate and hopefully spark a resurgence. When I go through the list of people who have participated in this series, these are all visionaries, who understand what this speech has meant and what it can continue to mean. I play it for my students on a regular basis, and each time it's invigorating. And I think of a couple things that we didn't get to touch on yet. One is Kennedy's vision of the university. What Trump is doing is destroying American universities, destroying American intelligence, destroying American speech, um, but destroying American research and turning the universities, knowing that the universities were in many ways the last stronghold of progressive thought in this country. He's waging a campaign to destroy America's universities and bring back a new dark ages. But secondly, in this speech, Kennedy talks about World War II. We've forgotten what World War II means in Russia today and what it meant in the Soviet Union. Kennedy said what the Soviets lost in World War II was the equivalent of of the United States east of Chicago having been wiped out. Kennedy uses the old figure of 20 million Soviet dead, but the figure that historians accept is that 27 million Soviets died in World War II. Do you know what 27 million means? I tell that to my students, but I try to put it in terms that they can understand. They know how the United States responded to 9/11. Well, in quantitative terms, what the Soviets lost in World War II is the equivalent of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. Can you imagine that? And that's what the Soviets lost. And Kennedy understood that. Um, and he talked about wasting money on weapons that could be used to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. Look which way the world is going now. Trump is pushing everybody to increase military spending. And the NATO countries have agreed to increase it from 2% of GDP to 5%, with the goal, according to Rutte and the other European hawks, to 10%. Eisenhower understood that. Stalin died on March 5th, 1953. Eisenhower stayed quiet. And then he made a great speech in which he said, every, every uh, bomb that's built, every bomber that's built, every dollar that's wasted on military is a theft from those who are hungry and don't get food, those who are unhoused and don't get shelter. It goes on, and again, it's a question of values. What's he doing? He's threatening Taiwan. Japan is doubling its military spending. Ishibai even called for Japan to have access to its own nuclear weapons, in addition to an Asian NATO. So we're seeing this all over the planet, and the world's going exactly the opposite direction of what Kennedy understood was necessary. But I also was thinking about one other thing. I was recently in Moscow. I was invited to Moscow to chair the documentary jury at the Moscow International Film Festival. And we picked our winner, and then they called me up that day, and they said they wanted me to make a speech. I said, "Well, what should I make a speech about?" They said, "Talk about the film that won." So I got up there to do that, and this is on live on national television inside Russia. It's the equivalent of their Academy Awards, so it's a big, big deal, national television. So I'm on there live, and I said that I had spoken that afternoon. I said, first, it's very meaningful to me to be one of only two Americans who was there at the film festival. The other is a great American actor named John Robinson. And I said in this prefatory remarks before I was going to talk about the film that won, and I said that this is very meaningful for me to be there. That afternoon, I had spoken at Moscow State University. And afterwards, they told me that I was the first American to have spoken there in more than 3 years, which I said made me very sad. And I said it reminded me of what Kennedy said in his commencement address, to think about how sad it is to think about the gulf between our two countries. And I went a little further and said, one of the things we have to do to rebuild the ties of friendship is end the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's interesting because you're not allowed to say that on national TV, but because it was live, it got out there. And a lot of people came up afterwards and said, you called it an invasion. I said, yeah, I did that on purpose. But also, the reaction I got in the hall there was tremendous applause. I mean, the Russians want to see this end, either because they're tired already or because they anti-war in principle. The Russians know what war is a lot more than the Americans do. And everybody I spoke to said that, for the week, 10 days I was there. And I got to speak on all the Russian TV stations and all the interviews. And the anti-war sentiment was widespread, but is not anti-Putin sentiment. It's important to understand that Putin's support is overwhelming, but the war, they want to see the war end. So it's just an interesting situation there. And now with what happened in Poland, it just shows how we could get involved in nuclear World War III by accident, by inadvertence, not by design. And in fact, if you look at what American war planners are talking about and writing about, uh, it's really war with China over Taiwan and the South China Sea. That's really what I've been writing about lately, because they're even, as Hegseth said, we have to end the war in Ukraine so we can focus on the real enemy, China. And that's what the Trump people believe, just like the Biden people believed it. And it's, so we're still controlled by madmen. And we still need the example set by Kennedy in the commencement address.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to have to bring our program to a close now, but I want to again thank everyone for attending. And again, anyone who has any ideas about how to spread awareness of President Kennedy's speech, you let us know. Our committee is more than willing to help, and you'll all be receiving a follow-up email from us. So thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to everyone for tonight's program. Good night.
Thank you.